Okay, so Felicia is here. How are you, Felicia?
I'm fine, thank you. How
Uh,
are you?
I'm great. And Czar is I'm not sure Czar's in the class anymore. Karen, is Karen here?
I'm here.
How are you?
I'm good.
And Thomas.
I'm here.
Thomas
I'm good.
and Yen.
Here.
How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
And Ariba is here. How you doing, Ariba?
I'm good, but I'm tired.
Got it. Me too. Nisha. Is Nisha here?
Yes, Professor, I'm right here.
How are you, Nisha?
I'm good, Professor. Thank you.
And Clement. Is Clement here? No. And Fahim. Is Fahim here? No. And Delavan is here. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. And Faye. Faye is here, correct? How are
Yes,
you?
I'm here.
Faye? And Sachin.
I'm here.
How we doing?
Okay.
And Anastasia is here, correct?
Correct.
How are you?
I'm doing well.
And Alexander is here. At least
Yep, I'm here.
his iPhone is here. How you doing, Alexander?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. And Nada. Maybe Nada's not, yeah, Nada's
I'm here.
How are you?
I'm fine.
And Angelica.
I'm here.
How are you, Angelica?
Good, how are you?
I'm great. Michael is here. How are you, Michael?
I'm good. How are you?
Great. Kazi. No Kazi. And Rosemary. No Rosemary. Brian. Brian. A little surprising. Carlos is here. How are you, Carlos?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm good.
Good. And Natalie is here. How you doing, Natalie?
Pretty good.
And Vicky. How are you, Vicky?
I'm here. How are you?
Great. And Ashley. No, Ashley. Okay. All righty. So, like I said, this is what we're going to look at today. The context, meaning context, both in terms of what is the situation that we find ourselves in at the outset of this play? What is the problem, which is to say, what is the issue that's driving the plot, which driving the story forward? We said every story is driven by a conflict, and we want to just establish clearly what the main conflict is. Of course, there's many related conflicts, as we'll see as we get into it. Context. We also want to talk about the location of this play. Obviously, it's a play by William Shakespeare. He is in Elizabethan England, born in Stratford-on-Avon, but lived a good bit of his life in London, where he was writing, staging, and also performing in plays. The play, of course, is set not in England, but in Venice at a time that's pretty much contemporaneous with the writing of the play, early 17th century England, except we're not in England, except we're in Venice, which has its own unique history. It's one of the most unique city-states in Europe that has always garnered a lot of attention historically for both the beauty of its architecture, the development of culture, of trade, its military and commercial prowess, particularly through a navy. It was very, very powerful in one of the most wealthy states during the Renaissance period when this play is set. And of course, another key element of Venice is just the kind of nature of the people, what people are like and how they're expected to act and carry themselves. And of course, there's a great contrast here between Othello, who is described in the title of the play as a Moor, of Venice, which is to say he's in some way, what's that Greek word, xenos? He's an outsider, he's a stranger, he's a foreigner. And the interesting thing we discover about Othello as the Moor of Venice, whatever a Moor is, we'll get to that, is that he is both of this world, right? There's a difference between living in the city versus being of the city. I think that goes back to St. Augustine. To be in the city is just to physically live within its boundaries, right? To be of the city is to be like a native, to be like someone who lives and breathes in that environment and feels at home, right? To feel indigenous, right? So there are some ways, interestingly enough, as the Moor of Venice, right, that Othello fits perfectly well into this world and in a kind of seamless way. He does not stand out in terms of many aspects of his character, by which I just mean the character itself, not his moral qualities just yet. But of course, there are other ways in which he obviously does stand out. And in both cases, he gets recognized for those ways he fits in with this world, but he also gets recognized for the way he does not fit in. And you might be surprised about the ways he does and does not fit in. I mean, one thing I should say about this play is the first thing that is typically discussed is obviously, you know, the race of Othello. He's a black man in a white European world, a Eurocentric world. But in many ways, he is assimilated and integrated into that European society. And for lack of a better word, you could say he has traits that are distinctly European by the standards of this world of Venice. So it's really important to appreciate what's going on in this play. You have to have a little insight into that setting of Venice. Because remember, if we go back to the beginning of the semester, I said that in grade school, when you talk about the concept of setting relative to literature, you think about a time and a place. That's obviously not at all unimportant to capturing what setting is. But what really matters about the setting is what the time and place represent, right? Are we in the 1930s Germany during the rise of Hitler? Are we in 1950s Germany in the aftermath of the war and all that entails, World War II, right? The setting is a world. The setting is a way of life, a way of thinking, a set of habits, a set of moral codes and conducts and customs, traditions that are infused in the conduct and the language and the psychologies of the characters. And we're going to see really clearly that Venice becomes its own kind of character in this play as we go forward. Yeah, so we want to finish the class by having a little discussion of what Iago's plot is, his plan. I like to think of Iago as almost like the author and the director of this play. Even, I mean, obviously Shakespeare wrote him, but within this fictive world of the play, Iago is like the true author or the puppet master or the director, if you think of film, staging a kind of plot. And this word plot, what are the two basic meanings of the word plot? What does the word plot mean? It has two meanings in two different contexts. One meaning in each context. What does the word plot mean?
Like the story.
Yeah, the plot is like the series of events and how they're structured and what happens. And within the context of a story, a narrative, right? A play in this case. It's just another version of, it's just a play is just another way of presenting a story, right? Pretty simple. What's the other meaning of plot?
Like a plan?
Yeah, like a plan or a scheme that normally has negative connotations. It's some kind of diabolical machinations or machinations, depending on how you pronounce it, machinations to carry out some objective that you have. And it's normally like nefarious and sneaky and underhanded and, done in the dark of night. So what's so great about plot as the key elements of the story that unfolded chronologically versus plot as a scheme is that with Iago as kind of the author of this play, in a sense, those two concepts of plot really merge. His scheme, well, let me ask you guys, in a nutshell, in one sentence, what is his basic scheme about? What does he want? What is his prime objective? What's his prime goal in this play?
He wants to become like the lieutenant, and eventually also like Othello, like he wants to become like the main, yeah, like a lieutenant.
I don't disagree. That's kind of established very early on, but what more? I mean, what's his real goal? I mean, if we've got a full understanding of the entire play, what's his primary goal? What you're saying is not untrue, but I don't think it gets to the heart of it quite.
Is it that he just wants to like ruin Othello's life or like something like that?
Yeah, and what's another word we can use instead of ruin? He wants to get blank.
Revenge.
Yeah, to sum it up in a nutshell, you could describe this as a revenge play. His goal is to get revenge against Othello for some real or perceived slight transgression against him by Othello in his eyes. And he wants to get revenge. He wants tit for tat. Now, this issue of what he wants to do immediately gets into the issue of why he wants to do it. What are his motives? And this is part of the test question, which we'll take up more explicitly next class, our last class. But the play raises what he wants to do to get revenge against Othello, to bring down Othello, is really straightforward and clear that is what he wants. The question of why he wants to do it, is a much less clear issue and quite fascinating. And it's not, it's mysterious. And it's not mysterious because he doesn't say anything about his motives. In fact, he says a number of important things about his motives. So what makes his motive or motives, because remember, we could be more than one, what makes his motives mysterious is not his lack of discussion of them, but his multiple discussions of them that start to make it somewhat unclear exactly why he's doing what he's doing. He's taking a very extreme, I mean, at the end of the play, Othello is dead and his wife is dead, all because of Iago's plot, right? So that's a pretty serious thing to do. You must have some pretty serious motives to want to do something like that. So then we're going to finish looking at the opening dialogue with Rodrigo and Iago, and particularly we're going to focus on Iago's, this is interesting, his explanation of himself. He gives really in the outset of the play, while Shakespeare is still laying out what you could call like a prologue, in almost any kind of, traditional style short story or play or novel, you get a kind of what I'm calling a prologue period of the situation or of the story, in which they establish the setting, the author establishes the characters, the author establishes the conflict, and so on and so forth. So at the outset of this play, we do not see Iago. We do not see Othello, we see Iago, right? And what does he do in this one speech? He gives this wonderful self-portrait, right? Of who he really is, quote unquote, who he really is. And there's an interesting problem with Iago giving a speech about who he really is. Let me ask this. Very often throughout the play, Iago is described as good friend Iago, honest Iago, which in and of itself, this word honest is very interesting. We typically think of this word meaning someone who is honest is truthful. We'll talk about this more next class. The word honest meaning truthful is how we've understood the word, I think, for a few hundred years. But what's interesting is that the word honest, coming out of, I guess, Latin and French, had a meaning of like having a good appearance. A person who is honest came across well to other people. So you can see how that having a good appearance and coming across well to other people would also be connected with being truthful, which is to say, an honest person is someone who appears, or let me reverse it. An honest person is someone who really is as they appear. Someone who really is inside what they are on the surface. So he's called Honest Iago by Othello many times, and not just Othello, by other characters. Is Iago an honest man?
No.
Natalie says no. What do other people think? Is Iago an honest man?
No, he's like a master manipulator.
Okay, so, and you're saying he's not honest in both senses, meaning not truthful, but also like he's got a good appearance to people, but
He's like really fake, and he's like everyone's friend, but he's really nobody's friend.
okay, very good. Yeah, good friend Iago. Everyone calls him good friend because one thing Iago does is the way he insinuates and gets leverage with people is he comes up to people in need and he says, I'll be the one to help you. You can trust me. A friend in need is a friend indeed. And friend, I see you need help and I'm going to be the one to help you. And therefore, I'm not going to say it to you, but you're going to be dependent on me. And they all think the world of him because they think that he's helping them out, whether it's Rodrigo, whether it's Desdemona, whether it's Cassio, whether it's Othello. They all think they're being helped by a friend. Anyone else? Is Iago honest? Is Iago an honest man? He's called an honest man many times in the play.
No, he's not honest.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Anastasia.
No, he obviously not honest.
Okay, good. I take it we're in consensus then. Good. I mean, if you read carefully, if you watch the film, it's a no-brainer. Okay. So the two definitions of honest that are connected, one being truthful, and the other is being as you present yourself as and presenting yourself well, and that what's inside is the same as the outside. What is one problem, interesting problem, in the way Shakespeare fashions this character of Iago is that this whole realm of the distinction between appearance and reality is manipulated, right? From what people have said, I think we can all agree that what Iago does is present the appearance, say, of friendship, but then the reality behind it is obviously very, very different. What are some names you would give to a person who presents one appearance, a good, a positive appearance, but a friendly appearance, for example, and yet behind that appearance is almost the exact opposite? What are some of the names you would use to describe a person like that?
Hypocrite.
Hypocrite is one great name. What else? What other names? For someone who presents one image, but in reality is almost exactly the opposite of the image they present.
And it's like fake.
Fake, that's good. That works. What else? Any other synonyms we can come up with here? Alexander, Michael, Fahim, you got synonyms for being fake or being a hypocrite? Obviously deceptive, absolutely. That's a basic good word. He's constantly deceptive. And what makes him so deceptive is that nobody knows he's being deceptive until the very end. And guess what? By the very end, it's too late. They can't do anything about it. What would you call if you met someone who you thought was a friend and you found out they were like him? What would you call them? A fraud? I think fraud is very good.
Coward.
Pardon?
Coward.
In a sense, I mean, that's an interesting one because he's very brazen in a lot of ways. But yeah, because he's not honest to their face. Of course, Iago would say, if I were honest to them, like I wouldn't be able to take advantage of them. So of course I have to lie. Like how does fraud succeed? It succeeds by the people believing the con man, right? So we could call him a con man. Yes, I think two-faced is very good. Another word that's basically a synonym for two-faced, duplicitous. What does duplicitous mean? Right? Duplicitous is literally like double, like one image and another reality. It literally, the root of the word implies two, like two-faced. Okay, good. Yeah, a trickster. Yeah, so there's a whole history of a tradition in certain types of narratives of trickster characters who play, in some cases, wicked practical jokes on people. I mean, this doesn't seem like a practical joke because it has such fatal consequences. A confidence man, right? I mean, think of the expression con man, right? People rarely think of the full meaning of the full term, which is actually confidence man. And how does a confidence man succeed in defrauding you? They succeed by gaining your confidence and lying to you and you believing the lie. Because if you don't believe the lie, if you don't have confidence in them, they're not going to succeed at their plot. Okay, so let me just ask a really stupid question because it needs to be asked. Sometimes I'm Captain Obvious. Sometimes the obvious needs to be stated. Does Iago go around telling the truth?
No.
No, right? So here's the problem. Here in the opening act, which we'll look at a little bit, he makes an autobiographical speech, a speech about himself, in many ways explaining who he is. And there are many instances in the play where he seems to be being totally forthright with us. We can talk about the circumstances. He does these asides that are actually really well depicted in the play. I mean, excuse me, in the movie, where instead of talking to another character within the bounds of the fiction, he actually turns to the audience and in a monologue, he speaks directly to us, right? And the funny thing is when he breaks that fourth plane and he looks out from the stage to the audience and says things about himself or says things about his plot or says things about his motive, our natural inclination is to think he's just telling the simple truth, because this is kind of a little cue that when he does, when you do an aside, you literally turn aside from the person you're talking to and speak to someone else. And classically, an aside in a film or in a play is where the character literally turns to the audience and engages like the actual real people, and they're breaking that, what's called the fourth wall, the kind of boundary of the fiction of the play. And so with this literary or theatrical device of the aside, we kind of seem to have a cue or a clue that when he does that, he's kind of speaking truth. And many of the things that he says in that context seem rather plausible as the truth. Among other things, he says some things about his motives in that context. But the interesting thing is this is a rhetorical, well, it's not a rhetorical question. It's a question that is a big question mark. It's not a statement. And I don't think it has a simple answer, which is, can we believe what Iago tells us, even when he's giving us these kinds of asides, even when he appears to be telling the truth, because we don't really know. And at the end of the play, I mean, he's explicitly asked by Othello, why did you do this to me? Like, what on God's green earth have I done to you to deserve this type of, torture? And he says, what you know. He says, about myself, zip, throw away the key. I'm not going to say anything, right? So a very mysterious character. I'm not going to read all this, but let me just make a few remarks. So Shakespeare lived at the end of the 16th into the beginning of the 17th century. He became the court playwright of first Queen Elizabeth and then King James I, who came to the throne right after 1603. King James I was the one that commissioned the King James Bible, the one that we read when we were looking at the Bible. It's kind of the basis for English literature in reference to the Bible. So one kind of basic observation I want to make about Elizabethan period is that, number one, a very dynamic period. Number two, it's described as part of the English Renaissance, but by the 17th century, late 16th, early 17th century, it has some very interesting different features from what you would think of as either classic Renaissance literature or even Renaissance painting and art in general. All of you are probably at least generally familiar with the Renaissance in, say, Italy, northern and southern Italy, where you have like the Florentines and the Venetian painters and people like Da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael and so on and so forth. One thing you see, for example, in Italian painting is that in many ways it's very realistic and naturalistic. But if you really are used to seeing kind of naturalism or realism, you realize that it's very kind of stylized, and it's very geometric, and it's very simplified, and it's very orderly. And what they've done is like taken the natural world that they observe with their eyes and filter it through a kind of harmonizing geometry. You see a lot of pyramidal structures and squares and rectangles and stability, and everything in Renaissance painting around between 1550 and 1600 is very idealized. What do we mean when we say something is idealized, whether it's a written representation of something or whether it's like a painting or a sculpture? What do we mean by idealized? Any thoughts?
Is it depicted in a better way or in an ideal way than the reality?
Sure. I mean, if you looked at a Renaissance painting, I mean, I should have a picture of one, but I don't. If you looked at a Renaissance painting, you'd say, darn, that's really realistic. But then if you put it next to a photograph, you would see all the ways in which they've idealized, say, the human form or the arrangement of the shapes, right? They're arranged in a kind of visual ideal. They're not real. They're better than reality. They're superior to reality. Like all the blemishes are removed, the warts and all, kind of not unlike, taking Photoshop to an image and, beautifying it and reshaping things to make them look more harmonious and even better than they do in real life. Okay, so two really interesting, just last little thing about the English Renaissance and this Elizabethan period in terms of art. So two really big elements of art in England as opposed to Renaissance Italy is that number one, there was much greater focus on the literary arts like poetry, plays, stories. And number two, that particularly with Shakespeare, you move from a period of idealizing the world to making it much more realistic and more palpable and more believable as kind of real world characters doing real world things in real world situations. Now, let me clarify this. Obviously, the language of Shakespeare is not the way people spoke on the street in London on a daily basis, right? It's clearly stylized, the language is in that sense. So when I talk about realism, it's not the way the characters speak, because they speak in this, Elizabethan stage style with certain pronunciation and, grammatical structure that's very complicated and challenging to understand very often. The realism comes through particularly in the way the characters are depicted and what they're like, right? And I'll give you an example. When we look at Job, Job's a great kind of counterpoint here. Is there any mystery what kind of guy Job is?
No.
Let's just put it this way. Absolutely not. What kind of guy is Job?
He's a good guy, honest guy.
Yeah. Job, the man of substance who is upright and God-fearing. Does Job, I know Job gets tested, but does he really change in any way throughout the story?
No, he's not.
Yeah, I mean, you could say some things are revealed about him that you might not expect, like he's not happy about being tested in this way, and he says so. But of course, the basic tenet of him being an upright man remains because he doesn't curse God and all that stuff. In a story like that, the character is like almost like a cardboard cutout, right? It's not a three-dimensional human being. It's a kind of a stereotype of a certain type of upright man, a man of good character. And the reader is supposed to have like a really straightforward, direct understanding of this is the kind of guy Job is. And there's not really supposed to be much meditation on it because the focus of the meditation is like what's happening to him and why is it happening and things of that nature. With Shakespeare, well, let's put it this way. Job is a one-dimensional character, right? But human beings are multifaceted. They act in many different ways, and they act a different way in each context they might be in. They have many different motives, and each circumstance they're in activates a different motive. Their psychology is not closed and straightforward, like we could say Job, or even Odysseus. I mean, Odysseus, we see a lot of different facets of that character, but at least by comparison to Shakespeare, the character is completely defined. There's nothing left open-ended or ambiguous about who Odysseus is, right? But real life, there's two big things about human beings in the real world. And I'm talking about like, you and me interacting with people out in the real world and trying to cope with all those dynamics that go with like interpersonal relations. Number one is people are complex, right? And number two is you never know all about the people you're interacting with. there's always kind of loose ends. There's always something kind of open-ended. There's always something that you can't completely pin down because you just don't know enough, but you have to form an impression of that person without ever having a kind of conclusive information about them. And then, of course, there's even more interesting things like, do human beings fully understand themselves? Do they understand fully their own motives for doing what they do, right? When Shakespeare paints these characters, particularly Iago, but the other, and to other characters to varying degrees, Othello, despite some of the major stereotypes that Shakespeare draws on in fashioning Othello, there are still some mysterious things going on with him that, you know, you don't have answers to. But particularly Iago, he's a very multifaceted character. In a different situation, he acts differently. And ultimately, we get to the question of exactly who he is and why he's that way and what his motives are. And they're not clear. They're not spelled out, and they're complex. And my simple argument here is that complexity and mystery is realistic in the sense that that's what human beings in the real world are actually like when you're trying to make sense of them. Okay. So let me mention, it's 8:30, a couple more things. So Shakespeare's players, his theater troupe is the Lord Chamberlain's Men. He becomes the playwright and part of the theatrical group running this business effectively for the king and his court, right? And he has this theater built in 1599 called the Globe Theater. And so why is it called the Globe? Well, first thing is, you see that it's circular, and almost the stage is actually more or less in the middle rather than simply at one end. And the idea is that it literally kind of depicts the globe. This is really important, I think, to getting an insight of what this period of time, their interest in what they saw on the stage, right? We're in the late Renaissance period. We're moving to an understanding based on the natural scientists, Copernicus and Galileo and whatnot, that the world is actually and definitively a sphere. It's not we're not on flat Earth. I don't know, it's pretty popular today, flat Earth. It's kind of interesting to look into. But as far as I can tell, we're on a sphere. And I've never seen it from outer space, so I'm skeptical enough to not say conclusively. But, whatever. You got to get up and like brush your teeth so you don't think about these things too much. But the globe was the place where the entire world could be on display, right? Which was that this theater and what it portrayed in terms of the plays that were produced and displayed were like a microcosm of everything out in the world. Microcosm being a little version of the whole cosmos, and the world in this sense being not so much to some extent the geographical world. So Shakespeare has multiple plays set in Venice, for example, is clearly a kind of fascination with the world of Renaissance Venice. But that it captured everything that's in the world, the good, the bad, and the ugly, in a sense, realistically, in terms of what it portrayed and in terms of the type of people it portrayed. And they were very fond of this expression that worked its way into the motto of the theater itself, along with the play As You Like It, which is that all the world is a stage, right? So that, the world, and we're just players on that stage. So this connection between everything going on out in the world and the stage itself, and that the stage was there to represent the world outside. Interesting in the last 100 years, because, for example, modernism has looked at the function of that stage and what is performed on it in a very different way, that it's not representative of the world, but it's its own artistic reality, autonomous from the rest of the world, and it exists within its kind of own closed or hermetically sealed sphere of activity and concepts and ideas. But clearly, I mean, Shakespeare, a playwright who was determined to capture both the high and sophisticated, but also the low and the body, and trying to capture all the dimensions of things that go on in the world and appeal to a broad audience, right? And in that sense, you might say his plays were intended to be very democratic in the different ways in which they appeal to different segments of society. Okay, alrighty. It's 8:30. We should touch on this now. And maybe we can save our discussion of Venice for next class. So very often when we think of this play, we just think of, oh yeah, the play is Othello, right? Othello. It's actually the tragedy of Othello, comma, the Moor of Venice. So you get this subordinate clause that helps to define who or what Othello is, the Moor of Venice, right? And what's interesting is that Othello is his proper name that signifies the person in a specific way, whereas the title, the Moor of Venice, captures a much more generic and stereotypical view of who this character is. He's no longer an individual as the Moor of Venice. He's just a Moor, which is a certain category, which also has certain set of stereotypes to a certain category of people, which we'll talk about in a moment. But it's a tragedy, a tragedy. Obviously, the ancient Greeks in the 5th century BC really established their genre of tragedy. And Shakespeare's genre of tragedy in many ways has important similarities. What is tragedy about? First of all, it's a genre of play, right? A tragedy, certain category of play. What is a tragedy? Does anyone have any ideas or just common sense ideas about some of what things that might be key characteristics of a tragedy?
The story with sad end.
Okay, good. Obviously, tragedy is associated with sadness, something deeply unhappy, something maybe even disturbing happening. Good, right? Some kind of trauma even. And what did you say, but beside just being sad, it what?
A story.
No. You said something about the ending.
Sad end.
Yes. All right, good. So all tragedies have a bad ending. And one of the funny dimensions of tragedy versus comedy, we think of comedy as being funny, but tragedies end badly and comedies end well. And Shakespeare has a play that perfectly captures what comedy is. And the title of the play is called All's Well That Ends Well. All's well that ends well. Comedies end well. Tragedies end badly. If you want to know one of the really interesting facts about the story of Job, is that it gets characterized, oddly enough, as a comedy, not in the sense that it's funny, but in the sense of how it ends, that Job is not in fact a tragic figure because he doesn't suffer a calamitous downfall and that the end ends badly. Not only does he get everything back at the end, he gets it back with interest. So tragedy is when the central character has this downfall and it all ends badly. Really important. So what happens when things end well? You leave a play feeling relieved, right? Job gets everything back and you're like, oh my goodness, like fake out. It didn't really happen, or it did, but it doesn't really matter now. So Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. So this play obviously ends badly. Who does it end badly for?
Everyone. Most
Yeah,
everyone.
in a sense, everyone. Obviously, Othello and Desdemona. Does it end badly for Iago?
Yeah.
Does it?
I mean, he doesn't like get killed. I mean, he doesn't really get killed, but like his plan doesn't work at the end. So he did everything.
Plan doesn't work.
I mean, like he doesn't become any better either. Like he drags everyone.
Okay, I mean, so that's why I probed about, obviously at the outset of the play, he talks about wanting to rise up the ranks and he's very upset that he was passed over for Cassio, right? But I think you come to see that even more so than that ambition, well, look, he does not get his ambition fulfilled by becoming the lieutenant. So how does he fulfill his ambition? He fulfills it by getting revenge against Othello, the big cheese, you could say. And, you know, you don't have to agree with me, and it's not a closed argument, but I would say in many ways that Iago achieves his goal. He brings down Othello, and I get the impression from this character, Iago, that once he succeeds in bringing down these two central characters, he doesn't care about what happens to him. He's succeeded. He's shown everybody his monstrous plot that was the monstrous birth of his wits, his head, his mind. Okay. Anything, just one more question about tragedy, and any other things that come to mind when you think of tragedy? A bad ending. How many people typically have the tragedy happen to them in a tragedy? Is it like all the characters or just one of the characters?
It's usually like one or two. I mean, I'm thinking about like also like on those like for Shakespeare plays, is usually like the audience knows what's going on and it's almost like you wish the characters knew, and that's a tragedy within itself. But then like for Othello, I think the tragedy was mainly like to him. I mean, he killed his wife and he's the one that kind of.
Yeah, so, you know, Desdemona doesn't get to have all the tragedy because like she's just a victim and he's the one who did it. And like, not only does he die at the end and that's tragic, but he was the one duped into killing her. Yeah. So very good. So in a traditional tragedy, there's really one central character who suffers a calamitous downfall. And one of the key features about a tragic figure is that they're normally larger than life, in the sense that they're normally depicted as a character who's superior to us, the audience, right? You know, you imagine a generic audience. We're like middle of the road, middle-class people, medium intelligence, medium success, all those things. The tragic figure is always someone who's superior to us, of greater stature, of greater renown, greater accomplishment, greater intelligence, what have you. You look at Oedipus in Oedipus Tyrannos or Oedipus Rex. So Othello clearly is this very renowned figure. And in fact, despite the fact that he's a Moor, an African of, relatively dark skin. I mean, there's debates about how he's performed and portrayed in terms of whether he's dark or brown or what have you. Not too relevant for this purpose, but he is a character who's greatly respected, who's what is his profession? What is his vocation?
He's a soldier, a general.
Absolutely. So he's a renowned soldier in general, and he's very accomplished. He's the, what does it mean to be a general in this context?
It's like higher up position in the army, I think.
Yeah, and within the Venetian military, he appears to be the highest. He appears to be I mean, we wouldn't use the word general because you'd be even like the commanding officer of the whole military, right? So really esteemed position. What happens to the tragic figure? They suffer a precipitous downfall, peripeteia, a reversal of fortune. Things are going well, fortune is reversed, things are now going very badly. What's fortune? It's luck, it's chance. Why do they suffer the downfall? Well, yes, they can get help from other people like Iago. This is one of the who is really responsible for Othello's downfall. This is one of the interesting features that you don't have, say, in an ancient Greek tragedy. With the ancient Greek tragedy, like the burden in many ways rests with the tragic figure, but here you've got Iago bringing about Othello's downfall. Why do they have this downfall? The Greek word is hamartia. It actually literally means to miss the mark, like you're shooting an arrow and you miss the target. But you could think of it as the tragic figure, as renowned as they are, as superior to us as they are, has some type of tragic flaw, some type of tragic flaw. And let's put Iago aside and his culpability here. This suggests that there clearly is a flaw with Othello. And if there's a flaw with him, it would seem that in his character, in his nature, it seems that some of the responsibility for what he does doesn't lie with Iago, but lies with Othello, right? And what do the circumstances of the play do? They bring out the Achilles heel, they bring out the fatal flaw in the character that encourages them to act in a way that actually brings about their own downfall. Setting aside Iago's responsibility for duping Othello, right, which is obviously a big thing, it's a big feature of the play. What are the flaws of Othello that bring about his own downfall, that make him responsible for what boy, he kills his wife. It's not like Iago takes his hand and holds a knife, in his hand and kills his wife. Well, of course he strangles her, but you get the idea. What are some of the major flaw of Othello?
His extreme love for his wife.
Okay, so this is really interesting, and I think that's well put. One of the big flaws of Othello is his intense, overpowering love for his wife. Let me say it this way. We could say in that sense, as David Hume said, he is in a certain way a slave to his own passions. And when you're slave to your own passions, you lack self-restraint. And when you lack self-restraint, bad things happen. It's like a classic ancient Greek, Roman analysis of why people do the wrong thing. Does anyone remember why Odysseus's men all die? What does the book say about the cause? And I don't mean the specific causes of their death, but the big overarching cause of why they all died on their attempt to come home from Ithaca. They weren't able to do what? It says it in the opening lines of the play, of the poem, and then it talks about it with Tiresias, the blind prophet in the underworld in Hades. What did they fail to do that brought about their downfall? Anyone remember?
I don't remember like the exact wording, but I feel like it was just like they didn't heed any of the warnings that they got, and they like always like just wanted more.
Yeah,
like,
very good. You pretty much got it. They weren't able to self-restrain. They weren't able to self-govern. They weren't able to control their desires and their passions, right? And the expression in the text that's used a handful of times is they failed to curb their desires. What is to curb their desires? Just means to stop them or restrain them, right? And the basic logic here is that a human being in their psychology has reason to think, but then they also have passions, and that reason and passions in the soul are in conflict with one another. Reason says, I think you should do this, but passion says, I want to do this. I want to do this because it feels good in the moment. And reason saying, well, if you do that, here's what's going to happen in the future with rational foresight, right? So this model of the soul of like as a battlefield between reason and passion, it goes straight back to the Greeks, Romans, and it's clearly on display here. Othello is not an unintelligent character. I mean, he is intelligent, but he has an Achilles heel. He has certain vulnerabilities and weaknesses when it comes to certain emotions that short circuit his ability to reason, right? And his emotions get the best of him. And one of them clearly is his love for Desdemona. You want to say anything more about the nature of his love for Desdemona?
I think he's like willing to sacrifice anything for her. Like at the beginning of the story, like the dad almost like kills him because they
Okay.
kind of like did it behind his back.
So let's sum it up this way. There are some very noble, high-minded features about his love for Desdemona. Look, I think he understands the kind of risks he took in courting this woman, being a Moor, which we'll get to in just a moment. Does anyone remember what he gets accused of in his whole courtship of Desdemona? Do they think his courtship is honest and above board? Anybody catch that?
No, they think he like tricked her
For what purpose?
so that she would like him and marry him
Mm,
and love him.
even more than that.
I don't know.
Anyone else? I mean, you're on the right track.
Was
What did
it
they think his love, quote unquote, for Desdemona was all really, what was it really about? The Europeans, like her father. What do they think it was really about?
Just to get like status and money.
And what else? Well, then we'll have to look at it next class. Okay, so there are absolutely some very noble and high. Let me ask this. Does he just want to sleep with her? Is that his MO in this situation? Or does he really care about her and does he really love her?
He seems to really care about her.
I'm sorry?
He seems to really care about her. He didn't
Yeah,
just do it for.
at the outset of the play, we get many depictions of his actions toward her and his statements, particularly a description of the courtship process. And in fact, he seems very innocent, very noble, very forthright in his motives behind seeking her hand, that they're all noble and good motives because he really loves her for who she is. Now, Angela said that it was actually his passions for his wife that brought about his downfall. Now, if his motives are so pure and so good for his wife, how could they possibly have brought about his downfall? Is there any, and what am I asking? Is there another side to his, let's take it for granted that he really is, he is a noble character. He shows many righteous virtues, an upright man, in a different way than Job, but some ways the same. He's an honest man. He expects human beings to be honest, straightforward, forthright with him, not duplicitous. He's not duplicitous. That's all considered, positive moral attribute. So let's say he really does have a noble love for her, but let's say that's not the whole story of his love for her. And that word love can mean a lot of different things, right? What are some of the less appealing attributes of his his feelings for her? What are some of the negative attributes of his love that maybe are not like what we would normally consider real love?
Obsession?
Okay, number one, he's obsessed with her. That's absolute. And one of the questions is, what is he, in terms of the negative aspects of his love, what is he really so obsessed about? What does he really want? In wanting to be with her, what does he really want from it? Why is he so obsessed with Desdemona?
Because he wants to be accepted.
Ah, very good. So we'll talk about who his identity in just a moment, because it speaks to this question of wanting to be accepted. Let's ask a general question. Is he accepted, generally speaking, within Venetian society, despite being in some ways an outsider, both in terms of the color of his skin and his origins? Is he accepted? Is he accepted in this world of Venice?
I want to say yes. If he is a general, that means, wouldn't that mean that they accepted him and they put him in a position?
Good. You'd want to say yes, and you'd be correct, but you'd also have to say it's not the whole story. He's a general. He's gotten to this pinnacle of the world of the military. That this is the highest for him that he can go as a soldier, right? And obviously, his race and his ethnicity, his cultural background, such as it is, because there's some interesting ambiguity about that compared to his mother, for example. He is obviously fully assimilated and fully appreciated as a Moor. He is clearly respected. I mean, the guy who's effectively the president of the Republic of Venice, he's just called the Duke, and normally in Venice, that's the Doge, right? The Doge is essentially the guy who presides over the Signoria. The Signoria is like the main governing body of the Republic, and he acts as a kind of president figure, like first among equals, right? And he puts Othello in charge of this major military campaign, and he acknowledges a deep respect. Even Desdemona's father has deep respect for Othello, except that all stops at the water's edge of marrying his daughter. He loves Othello until he marries his daughter secretly. And he says, well, I loved you in this context as the general of the Republic, and I a senator, legislator, just like we have senators. But once you marry my white European daughter, it's a bridge too far for me. And he can't accept that. And it's some combination of not accepting the Moor marrying his daughter, but also that it was done illicitly behind closed doors. And of course, he thinks the worst of the motives for marrying behind closed, eloping secretly as they do. So in many ways, Othello is accepted, but not completely. Any evidence you can suggest that he, we're going to skip that speech because it's already 8:56. We might finish a few minutes early here. What signs do you get that he's not completely accepted and assimilated into Venetian society? Any little clues that pop out?
I think even Iago has a problem with him being his general.
Okay, so he doesn't respect a Moor being his superior.
No, I feel like he's very upset about that. He's also upset that what's his name, Cassio, it's in front of him, but I think also he speaks very poorly of the Moor.
Yeah. Oh, well, there you go. You just said it. Instead of one of the things that we'll see is that instead of being called Othello, when they want to say something negative about him, they call him not Othello, but just the Moor, right? He's just reduced to a stereotype. And that's why this title, Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice, is so important in the dual identity that it suggests And it raises these questions of both assimilation and lack of assimilation. So how is it that being married with Desdemona represents, like, I don't know, the ultimate grail of assimilation for Othello? Does everyone understand what I mean by assimilation? For someone to be assimilated in a society, what does that mean?
Like fully a part of.
Yeah, integrated, a part of, continuous with, seamlessly. Good. How is marrying Desdemona the ultimate in being integrated into that society or assimilated?
Because he will be like a part of like a family, he'll have his own family where he would also be part of a family.
Yeah, sure. And her father is what?
A senator.
Yeah, so he obviously comes from, I mean, we're talking about a senator in the age of the Renaissance, right? Not a senator today where you just get elected. Senators then were bloodline nobility, right? Their families were of noble birth. So here, if Othello can marry into a family of noble birth and, you know, extend that family, I mean, that's a very clear sign of a high level assimilation that even the average Venetian wouldn't be able to partake of. How else by marrying Desdemona is he assimilating and getting so someone said it's his desire. He loves Desdemona because she represents like, by being married, the ultimate acceptance into the society. I think it was really well put. What other aspects, how is that manifest? This acceptance by his love for her is not just about her. His love for her is about the fact that she represents this kind of token of ultimate assimilation. First of all, what does she look like? There's some really simple visual dimensions to this.
She's very fair.
Yeah, she's beautiful. She's fair. This word fair comes up over and over again. What do we mean by fair?
Like her skin color, she's very white.
Yeah, fair skinned, light skinned. She's not just a European, she's also a light skinned European and spends all her time inside instead of out like working in the fields. She's got blonde hair and she's constantly described as kind of angelic, like a, you know, like a Cupid doll or like those angels you see in the paintings, Renaissance paintings up there floating around in the heavens with wings and stuff like that, looking all angelic, right? So, I mean, like some kind of a very simple idea here that we can all understand from our own society and its stereotypes, you know, blonde hair, fair skin, you imagine blue eyes, right? And he is this dark-skinned man, kind of yearning to be part of the group and in many ways integrating, but kind of always knowing in the back of the mind that there is some kind of limit that his identity seems to come up against, that like the notion of ultimate complete assimilation is not really possible, in not just in his own mind and also in the way he's treated. Brabantio, Desdemona's father, right? The moment that he catches wind of this marriage and he's upset and he calls Othello out for basically sexually seducing his daughter, he just assumes it. He stops calling him Othello and just calls him the Moor, right? And the whole specificity of who he is drops out, and he's just the black man who's sexually appealing to the white European woman. And that's all he can see at that point. Okay, good. What is the primary emotion? We've been talking about, what have we been talking about here? Definition of tragedy, that each tragic figure has an Achilles heel, or they have hamartia, they commit a grave error because they have some type of vulnerability or weakness, and that his weakness is his inability to control his emotions in certain situations, and that one of the big emotional problems for him is his love of his wife. What is the emotion that I think we're all familiar with in some way, shape, or form that really brings about his downfall, particularly killing his wife?
Jealousy.
Yeah, okay. The insidious emotion, the green-eyed monster of jealousy. Let's just clarify that for a second.
Can I
What
ask you a
exactly?
question?
Yes.
In the movie, like every time Iago would tell him something, it seems like Othello was like possessed. Was that just the jealousy of taking over?
Yeah. That's good. So it's in the play itself, but there's a certain kind of like, well, he has these like epileptic seizures, right? And in the play, they're described, and in the film, he has them, these kind of like frothing blackouts. And of course, you could think of a seizure as simply like a medical condition, but it's clear that these seizures he has are connected with his psychological and emotional state of mind. And they're part of his moral makeup as much as like, they're not really about some medical condition so much. And what happens is when Iago incites Othello with his provocative words about what he says is happening, it's like Othello gets consumed by his emotions to such an extent he kind of loses himself in these epileptic fits, right? And that's really a symbol of his lack of emotional control in these circumstances. Absolutely. And you see them depicted a few times in the film. And they're in the written dialogue of the play as well, if you look closely. What is jealousy exactly? How do we describe what it means to be jealous? It's funny, we all know what it is, but to actually describe it's not always so clear or easy.
It is hard.
I feel like there's different kinds of jealousy. Like you could be
Yeah,
jealous.
let's be clear. I'm with person X. They're my person. I'm with them, they're with me. If I ever see them with another person, I'm going to get really angry and upset because that other person shouldn't be talking to the person I'm with. They shouldn't be acting like they're friendly. I feel threatened by it.
I don't know. It's like actually really hard to explain.
Yeah.
I would say like it's like an emotion of, I don't even know. It's like someone's obviously upset, but I don't really actually know how to explain it.
How does this comes back? How does Othello's love manifest for Desdemona? Does he treat her like an equal person who he just loves for her own sake and respects and is considerate about every dimension of her? How does he go about loving her? Maybe I'm not
possessive.
Yes. She's not just an object of affection, she's an object of possession. So this is where jealousy becomes clear. It's not just that I love the person is mine. And my worth, jealousy comes from like a threat to your sense of self-esteem or self-worth. That person is mine. I possess them. That's what it means to love them. And when I possess them, I feel good about myself. But if I sense that someone else might be trying to possess them, I'm going to be very angry because my self-worth is tethered to this notion that my love manifests as possessing them, right? Obviously, this is a tricky balancing line for anybody in any relationship between loving someone for their own sake and a feeling of possessing them, right? And why does he want to possess her? Because it gives her a sense of self-esteem. He wants to possess her because she's that emblem of assimilation, I think. And it really becomes clear, right, that maybe what he loves about her, I mean, in time, the play seems to reveal something we didn't know at the beginning about the nature of his love for her, which is that he really seems to love her. I don't know, you could give percentages about how much or make like a pie chart. Like we could disagree on exactly how big the pieces of pie are. But clearly a big part of his loving her has to do with the fact that he wants to possess her because she represents his acceptance into that society. And that she is like, she's a symbol that he wants to be able to show everybody else, right? People like to have their handbag, they call it, you know, the person they go out with to be seen with. And here there's a version of that, but it's a little more serious because this woman now represents like the highest level of integration that he can have. And if she's cheating on him, his whole status as assimilated and comfortable with himself, because he clearly wants to assimilate, is now under threat, right? And you can see how this goes way beyond simply appreciation of her qualities, her appearance, her character, versus appreciation of what she gets him in that society at large when third parties are looking at him and his wife. Okay. All righty. So Othello, yeah, it's based on a story by Boccioni, Boccaccio, because Shakespeare and other English playwrights were looking very heavily to Renaissance literature coming out of Italy. So this story of a certain kind of leader, but also outsider. And a Moor, what is a Moor? Moor is, in the fullest sense, because there's some issues with Othello's identity, a Muslim who comes from North Africa, that's mixed Arab and Berber, which is indigenous North African people, as a result of the Arab conquests of the Mediterranean during the medieval period, right? So as all of you might know, but should know, the Arab conquests during the Middle Ages extended all across the southern part of the Mediterranean, meaning North Africa, and then north to Italy, like Sicily is heavily influenced by Arab and Moorish culture, and particularly Spain, the southern part of Spain. Andalusia is incredibly, it still has all kinds of architecture, and the general influence of the food and culture still to this day has a resonance of the Arab influence as a result of the conquest of the Middle Ages. And of course, during Columbus's time, like 1492, there was what was called the Reconquista, where the European Spaniards reconquered over the period of a few hundred years the land from the Spanish, from the Arab influence and Moorish influence, and they initiated things like the Inquisition, and the exile of the Moors and Jews from Spain and things like that. Okay, so so an interesting cultural background for this character, right? North African Muslim. Sometimes this word Moor is simply just synonymous with the word black, or in Spanish, negro, right? Greek word moros, it means black. But so one of the key things about this term is that it has two related but somewhat distinct connotations. On the one hand, Moor can just mean a black person, a person of color, as we say today, right? On the other hand, it refers to a specific cultural and historical group of people as a result of this history, right? Of Arabs with Berbers, who were a native indigenous tribe to North Africa. Okay. So what did I want to say here? I totally lost my train of thought. Oh, 912. Is Othello a Muslim? A Moor, typically, Muslim, black Muslim from North Africa. Important question. Talk about assimilation in Venetian society during the Renaissance?
He seems pretty Christian.
He seems pretty Christian. Anybody want to put the qualifications to rest here? Does he just seem pretty Christian, or is he Christian? If you get to the last lines of the play, it's really conclusive where he stands on this issue. We haven't talked much about the plot. So we start out with the play situated in Venice, and then everybody ends up assembled at the Doge's Palace, which is like the kind of like the Capitol building in Venice. And the film is shot on location. So you're actually getting the buildings that were built during the medieval period that existed during the Renaissance period, which would have been the actual buildings they were in. So you get like a really authentic, if you go to Venice today, and a lot of those buildings were built during the medieval period, and they were the ones that would have been used during the Renaissance. And many of them, the other ones, were built during the Renaissance. So it looks like the film really looks like, in many ways, what it did then, in the aggregate. And they assemble because there's a conflict, a military conflict, and Othello gets put in charge of the conflict. Where do they go once they get shipped out of Venice? Where do they end up?
Cyprus.
Yeah, in Cyprus. And what are they supposed to be doing there? Cyprus is an island kind of toward the eastern end of the Mediterranean, right?
Fighting the Turks.
Yeah, the Turks. And who are the Turks?
People from Turkey.
Yeah, there's like a whole basically Ottoman Turkish Empire. And so not just Turkey. They are Christians?
Muslims.
Yeah, they're Muslims. Absolutely. He's fighting against a Muslim army, right? And so this has a very extensive historical roots, both in terms of Venice leading naval military campaigns against the Turks, which were the great power in contrast to the European powers. And for an extended period of time, they were really dominant over a lot of, they were constantly encroaching on Europe. And this conflict went on for hundreds of years between certain European states, France, Germany, and all the different principalities of Italy, because it was not a united country until the 19th century. And actually the Turks, this empire that was in existence in the 1600s, 1700s, existed up until actually World War I, and it really ended. The Ottoman Empire ended with World War I, and this East-West conflict between European Christians and Turkish Muslims went on for a very long time. So he's fighting against Muslims. He's leading an army against Muslims. Is Othello a Muslim or a Christian, or you're not sure?
Most probably he's not Muslim.
Yeah. So number one, it's pretty clear he's a Christian. And the things he talks about and the things he says make it really clear that he is a practicing Christian, and therefore assimilated in the European society. Number one. Number two, he talks about his mother very briefly, because he got the handkerchief from his mother, the token that he gave to Desdemona, that then ends up in other people's hands and becomes the ocular proof of her infidelities and all that good stuff. So his mother clearly is, if you picked up the description of her, she's clearly not Christian, and you don't get the sense that she spent any time living in the European world, right? Historically, there were Moorish diplomats, Moorish military men who did exist and spend time in European urban centers like London, for example, or Venice. Venice was an incredibly cosmopolitan city. It was a place that was a kind of microcosm of the world. Venice really sat at the departure between East and West. And because it was a very rich society and a very powerful one politically and militarily, largely because of its navy, which engaged both in commerce and trade with the East, the Near East, the Middle East, what have you, but also a military navy, right? So what exactly is Othello's background? We don't get every last detail, but it's clear that he spent, it seemingly, most of his life in European society, right? The way he speaks, his values, his virtues, his principles, his religious orientation, all speak to basically he's European. Like, it's just very straightforward in a lot of ways. Yeah, so let me just go back to the distinction here in the title, which is that he's described in two ways. He's described as Othello, the individual, but he's also described as the Moor of Venice. One is specific to his unique identity, and the other is a descriptor that just captures him as a stereotype. And we can see here just in the title, the problem of his assimilation that Shakespeare is pointing out, right? And that tension. When they want to individualize him and humanize him, the characters speak to him as Othello. But when they want to dehumanize him and kind of put him in the box of a stereotype, they call him the Moor, right? And so this play is really complex in terms of how it treats his identity. I mean, I think the first thing we think of in our world is, oh, he's Black, and therefore they're Europeans, and therefore they're racist, right? There is no doubt a racist component to the character's prejudices about him, but it's certainly not the whole story, number one. And Moor doesn't necessarily just refer to skin color, although it can. And then the other thing is, you know, what are Iago's motives? Is he simply motivated to bring about Othello's downfall because of his cultural background, his race, his color of his skin, etc.? I think the clear answer is definitely no. Does he have a prejudice about the guy that he plays on when he feels like it? Absolutely. And other characters too. But the one thing that is enjoyable about this play is that, first of all, I mean, Shakespeare is acknowledging the prejudice that the white Europeans have against this man, right? And when that prejudice is depicted for a man who in many ways is very righteous, right, it actually makes the Europeans look not so good. So this is an endless conversation, but I think there's a pretty balanced approach by Shakespeare in terms of how, and a sophisticated one in terms of how he treats Othello's identity. And, you know, one of the great questions is this kind of emotionalism of Othello that leads to his downfall. Is Shakespeare attributing it to Othello as an individual, or is he making a stereotype of a person of this background and race, etc.? And I don't think there's a simple answer there. I think you could cut both ways about it. Let's do this. We got a couple minutes left. And next class, we're going to dive into speeches, which are really going to be crucial for the exam. Let's go over really quickly what the plot is here. I said the plot that Iago cooks up, his scheme, is basically the same as the plot of the play. What exactly is that plot in a nutshell? He wants to get revenge against Othello. He wants to bring about his downfall. How exactly does he do it? It's pretty sophisticated, right?
So the plot, I guess it starts with what's his name? Not
Rodrigo, yeah.
So it starts
And,
with
and
him.
Rodrigo is whom?
He is this man who has money. He's wealthy.
Yeah, he's a
but
rich man. Absolutely. That's
Um,
important because he thinks
so-
he's going to buy something with his money.
Yeah, so he is obsessed with with Desmona.
Good. So this issue of eros, of love, is a major theme throughout the play. And Rodrigo turns out to be afflicted with this obsessive type of possessive love, just like Othello. They had, as ridiculous as Rodrigo is, and he's a comic character. I mean, he's portrayed that way in the film, but he's not kind of comic relief. But they're both afflicted by these bad elements of kind of obsessive desire. Okay, yeah, keep going.
Yeah, so then he's obsessed with her, and then he also wants to like be with her. So then he pays money to Iago so that Iago interrupts their like relationship, and like he's able to end up with Desmona at the end. So he ends up coming to like war with them, and then Iago convinces him to kind of like mess with Cassio, and he portrays Cassio as this drunk man and makes him lose command, so that he.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. So one thing, we'll kind of try to wrap it up here, but one thing Iago does is by taking advantage of the other characters' neediness and weaknesses, he then uses the characters as like proxies, or you could say cat's paws, like for his own objectives, and he exploits them. They become instruments and tools to achieve his own goals. So he brings about Cassio's downfall by getting him kicked out of his lieutenant spot, which is the one that Iago was so desperate for. And then what happens? What does Iago do then to mess with Cassio and start to involve Desdemona, which ultimately leads to the downfall of Othello?
So he convinces Cassio that the best way to kind of like get in good terms with Othello is to befriend his wife and like convince her to convince Othello.
Good, yeah. So he gets drunk, he makes some mistakes, he gets booted out of office and demoted, and Iago finally gets the position as right-hand man, as lieutenant to the general that he wanted from the beginning, that he talks about. And then Iago says, despite the fact that Iago had just done this to Cassio, of course he doesn't know that, Iago says, hey, Cassio, come here. I know how you can get back in the good graces of Othello. Go talk to his wife, and she likes you so much, and Othello likes her so much. Othello will do whatever she says, and just get in her ear, speak in her ear to get you back in good graces. And what problem does that cause?
So now the wife is like, looks like she's advocating for Cassio. So it almost seems like.
And of course she is advocating for him.
Yeah, but since Iago already by this time, he had already put that in his head, like, oh, look, they're kind of like too friendly, but I don't like, he kind of starts to say, oh,
Okay,
you
good.
shouldn't trust her, but then he's like, no,
So,
never mind, I'm not gonna say anything.
Yeah. So on one hand, he's setting up this interaction between Cassio and Desdemona, and on the other hand, duplicitous, two-faced. At the same time, he's setting up Othello to view that relationship through a particular lens, that this is not an innocent interaction. Oh, look how they talk to each other, right? And then what happens?
Yeah, so then he eventually gets to him, and like he makes he kind of just plays everyone. He involves his wife because his wife's the servant of the wife. So he gets this handkerchief from the wife that would only, like, it's kind of like seen as like she gave this to Cassio while they were like sleeping or whatever they were doing, whatever he thought they were doing. So eventually that's like the last straw, because Othello also gets upset. At some point, he does get upset at Iago because he's like, wait, you're talking like but you don't know anything. and now you have to like bring proof to me. So then he's like,
Okay,
okay,
good. And the handkerchief is proof of what?
of the infidelity.
Of the infidelity of Desdemona, and that's like the kiss of death, right? And she's gonna get it once
So
that's
after
done.
that, he gets Cassio to speak about another woman, but it seems like
Yeah. So that's awesome. That's almost too much. Let's just finish with this. Othello says, so Iago's been insinuating your wife's been unfaithful, but he doesn't say it. He doesn't come out and say it. And finally, Othello grabs him by the lapels, so to speak, and says, you better bring me the proof of this infidelity, or I'm going to have a problem with you because you're besmirching my wife. You're saying these terrible things. And if you're going to say such awful things, you better have proof. And he says very specifically, bring me the ocular proof. The ocular proof. Anybody know what that means? The ocular proof?
like he can see it.
Yeah, ocular, the root of it, oculus, is just eye. Give me the proof that I can see with my eyeballs. The ocular proof ends up being the handkerchief. Is the handkerchief proof of the appearance of the handkerchief in Cassio's hands, Bianca's hands? Is it proof of Desdemona's infidelities?
No, but Othello thinks it is.
Yeah, no. And what do we have here? Ocular, appearance. It's the appearance of proof. It's actually a physical thing. You're like, holy smokes, that's evidence. It's hard evidence. It's a smoking gun. The only problem is the gun shot somebody else, I suppose, instead of the person you think. So this handkerchief sits at the center of the play as the so-called proof. It's so palpably real, and yet it's not actually proof of anything. And it has the appearance of being the proof, the appearance of the proof of infidelity, but in reality, it was just one more scheme cooked up by Iago to make it appear that that thing was the proof when in fact it was not. So we have Iago constantly throughout the play presenting appearances mostly of himself. He pretends to be one type of person when he's in fact another. He's everybody's friend when in fact it's like he's everybody's enemy. It's like he hates everybody. And then of course the handkerchief appears to be the proof, but in fact in reality it's not. Okay, so let's stop. Let's finish it right there, and we'll pick up next class. What we'll do is look at clips of the film and then read the corresponding speeches and dig down into them in preparation for the final exam. So does anybody have any thoughts, question, comments before we go here?
So did you take attendance? Came in a little late.
Yes, I did. Otherwise, if you don't have any questions, everybody have a great night. Who needs to be taken down for attendance?
Fahim?
Fahim, yeah, got it. Any other thoughts, questions, or comments before we go here?
I have a question.
Yes, Delvin, go for it.
We don't have any more discussion boards, right? We just have the Turnitin assignment.
I meant to mention, we have the Turnitin assignment, which I have to post. So everything is there, but the actual assignment's not up yet.
Okay, so this week was our last discussion board, and then the Turnitin, and then the final, and that's it?
Correct.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Nisha. Have a great night, everybody.
Hey, Professor, I just have a question. I didn't realize we had a discussion board today, so due today. Can I just submit it a little late?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, I'll submit it.
Yep.
Thank you.
Right.
Have a good night.
Good night, Natalie.
Have a good night.
Good night, Anastasia.